The first night, her dog refused to sleep near the stove, like something behind the wall was awake. At 68, Elena Marquez returned to her grandmother's timber house on the edge of Silver Ridge with one plan: fix it, list it, leave it behind. The mountain stood silent behind the stone wall, older than memory. But on the third night, her German shepherd froze at the stove, ears lifted toward something deep inside the ridge. And that was when the house began to answer. If you found something hidden beneath your own home, would you stay or walk away? The highway thinned long before the mountains appeared. At first, it was just fewer cars, then fewer buildings, then long stretches of open land where the wind moved in low waves across dry grass. Elena Marquez kept both hands steady on the steering wheel and watched the road narrow into memory. She hadn't driven this way in almost 20 years. Atlas sat in the passenger seat, tall and composed, his dark sable coat catching stray beams of winter sunlight. His ears shifted at every curve in the road, not nervous, just attentive. He always listened to what she didn't. The dashboard clock read 2:17 p.m. 2 days ago, she had cleared out the last of her classroom at Westbrook High. 31 years teaching art. 3 decades of charcoal dust on her cuffs and student projects stacked against the back wall. The principal had used careful words: budget realignment, restructuring, appreciation for her service. She hadn't argued. She'd packed her brushes in a cardboard box and left before anyone could offer a farewell sheet cake. At 68, you don't fight for space anymore. You just step aside. The mountains rose slowly on the horizon, blue and distant at first, then solid and undeniable. Silver Ridge sat beyond them. A town that smelled like pine sap and cold metal. A town that had never pretended to be more than it was. Atlas shifted in his seat as the road began to curve upward. He braced himself naturally with each bend, steady, disciplined. He had ridden beside her on long drives before. Shelters, vet appointments, quiet escapes after the divorce papers were signed 5 years ago. He never complained, never asked questions. Elena rolled the window down an inch. The air changed immediately. Thinner, sharper. It carried snow even though the sky was clear. Silver Ridge appeared without announcement. A weathered wooden sign nailed to 2 posts leaned slightly to the right. The paint had peeled around the edges, but the letters were still legible. Welcome to Silver Ridge. Population 612. She drove slowly through the main street. The hardware store still had the same cracked window pane patched with tape. The diner's neon coffee cup flickered in daylight like it always had. A pair of older men stood outside the general store, hands buried deep in their jacket pockets, watching her car pass. One of them squinted. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. Small towns remember faces even when they forget names. Atlas let out a low breath. Not a growl, not a warning. Just awareness. His amber eyes tracked the movement of a pickup truck pulling out behind them. Elena kept her gaze forward. The road out of town narrowed again, climbing toward the ridge. Snow lingered in the shadows beneath the trees. The pine forest grew denser as she approached the old turnoff. There it was, a dirt path half hidden by brush and thyme. She slowed and turned the wheel carefully. The tires crunched over gravel and frozen patches of mud. Branches brushed lightly against the sides of her Subaru. Atlas sat taller now, eyes scanning the tree line, nostrils flaring at unfamiliar scents. It's okay, she said softly. He flicked an ear toward her voice but didn't relax. The clearing appeared gradually. First the open space between the trees, then the roofline. Then the whole structure, settled into the slope like it had grown there. Rosa Alvarez's house. 2 stories. Timber frame. Stone chimney built from rock pulled straight from the mountain behind it. The porch sagged slightly on the left side. Snow drifted in quiet pockets along the railing. It looked smaller. Or maybe she had grown. Elena turned off the engine. Silence pressed in immediately. Not the kind of silence you get in a city apartment. This one had depth, layers, wind moving high in the branches, a distant creak of wood adjusting to cold. Atlas stepped out first when she opened the door. He landed lightly in the snow and paused, surveying the perimeter. His tail hung level, not tense, not wagging, just steady. He circled the car once, then moved toward the porch, nose lowered. Elena grabbed her coat from the back seat and stepped into the cold air. It hit her lungs with a clean sting. For a moment, she just stood there and looked at the house. This wasn't supposed to be permanent. She had told herself that 3 times already. Fix it up, clear it out, sell it in spring, temporary. She climbed the porch steps carefully. The boards groaned beneath her weight, a sound she remembered from childhood summers when she used to run barefoot across them while Rosa called after her to slow down. Atlas sniffed along the doorframe, then stepped back, waiting. The old iron key felt heavy in her palm. Rosa had mailed it to her years ago, wrapped in tissue paper with a short note. In case you ever come home. Elena slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first, stiff with neglect. She turned it slowly, feeling each internal click. The door opened inward with a long, tired sigh. Cold air rolled out. The smell came next. Dry cedar, old stone, something faintly herbal, like sage that had burned years ago and never fully left. Atlas stepped across the threshold cautiously. He paused inside, scanning the corners, then moved farther in, nails clicking softly against wood. Elena followed. Dust floated in thin beams of afternoon light that slipped through the windows. The heavy oak table stood where it always had. A woven blanket lay folded over the back of a chair. The iron stove waited against the stone wall. Nothing had changed. And everything had. She set her bag down near the doorway and walked slowly into the center of the room. The floorboards felt firm beneath her boots, solid, reliable. Atlas moved room to room without rushing. He checked the hallway, the staircase, the back door. Each time he returned, he glanced at her briefly before moving on. Protective, always protective. Elena ran her hand across the surface of the table. A thin layer of dust coated her fingertips. "This is just for a while," she murmured to the empty house. Atlas stopped mid-step and looked at her. Outside, the wind shifted direction. It moved down from the ridge behind the house, brushing along the stone wall in a low, steady breath. The mountain stood directly at the back of the property, rising in dark layers of rock and pine. From here, it felt close enough to touch. Elena walked to the window and looked up at it. She remembered standing in this same spot as a child, while Rosa pointed to the ridge and told her stories about weather patterns and soil lines and the way rock settles when it's been left alone long enough. Back then, the mountain had felt like protection. Now it felt like witness. Atlas came to stand beside her. His body leaned slightly against her leg, warm and solid. She placed her hand on his head and let out a slow breath. temporary, she told herself again. But the mountain did not answer. It only watched and listened. Elena stood there a moment longer, her hand resting on Atlas's head, feeling the warmth of him against the cold edge of the window glass. The wind moved again along the back of the house, a low, steady push against stone and timber. Atlas's ears shifted. Not sharp, just attentive. She stepped away from the window and walked farther into the room. Dust coated everything in a thin, pale layer. The late afternoon light stretched long across the floorboards, highlighting scuff marks she remembered from childhood summers. She could almost see herself running barefoot from the kitchen to the porch, Rosa calling out in Spanish to slow down before she broke her neck. The air felt heavier inside than it had from the porch. Preserved. Held. She shrugged off her coat and draped it over the back of a chair. The fabric sent up a small cloud of dust when it landed. Atlas sneezed once and blinked at her, then resumed his quiet inspection. He moved through the living room with purpose, nose low, pausing at corners. He checked beneath the staircase, then walked down the narrow hallway toward the small bedroom at the back. His nails clicked softly, echoing in the stillness. Elena followed him. The bedroom door creaked open with a familiar complaint. The quilt Rosa had stitched decades ago still covered the narrow bed, faded but intact. A cedar chest sat at the foot of it. The curtains hung stiff and unmoving, their lace yellowed with time. Atlas entered slowly. He didn't jump onto the bed, didn't paw at anything. He circled once, sniffed along the baseboards, then moved toward the window that faced the ridge. He stood there a long time. "What is it?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer, of course, but his body language shifted slightly. Not alarm, just alertness. The ridge loomed directly beyond that window, dark against the pale sky. Elena pulled the curtain aside. The glass was cold beneath her fingertips. From this angle, she could see how close the slope actually was. The rock face rose sharply behind the house, layered and jagged, patched with pine roots gripping wherever they could find soil. The house had always felt tucked in, protected. Now it felt pressed against something older. She let the curtain fall and moved back toward the kitchen. The iron stove stood against the stone wall that separated the house from the mountain. The stones were uneven, set by hand long before she was born, some darker than others, some smooth from decades of heat. Atlas returned to the main room and stood near the stove. He lowered his head and sniffed once along the base of the stone wall. Then again, Elena noticed. "Mouse?" she offered lightly. He didn't react to the tone. He simply shifted his weight and continued mapping the room in slow arcs. She moved to the kitchen counter and opened a cabinet. Inside were mason jars coated in dust, their contents long dried out. Dried beans, cornmeal, a jar of something that might once have been peaches. She closed it carefully. The sink pipes rattled faintly when she turned the handle, then groaned back into silence. No running water. She had expected that. She'd brought jugs from town. She'd make it work. Temporary, she reminded herself. She set a small camping lantern on the table and switched it on as the daylight thinned. The glow softened the room. Atlas settled briefly near the doorway, but only for a moment. He rose again and walked the perimeter, nose brushing along the floorboards. German shepherds don't settle until they know the boundaries. The sun slipped behind the ridge faster than she remembered. Mountain evenings came early. Shadows deepened in the corners of the room. The temperature dropped with quiet efficiency. Elena knelt beside the iron stove and fed it small pieces of kindling she'd stacked earlier from the shed. The first flame caught reluctantly, then steadied. The smell of burning pine filled the air, mixing with cedar and dust. Warmth spread slowly outward. Atlas finally lay down near the center of the room, though not fully relaxed. His head remained upright, ears adjusting at faint sounds outside. The wind shifted again. This time it didn't just brush the exterior. It seemed to slide along the back wall, a low whistle, almost like air squeezing through something narrow. Elena glanced toward the stone. It was probably nothing. Old houses breathed. Wood expanded and contracted. Stone settled. She had lived in enough older buildings to know that. Still, the sound lingered. Atlas lifted his head sharply, his eyes fixed on the stove, not at the fire, at the wall behind it. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just watched. The wind pressed again, harder this time, and something along the stone made a faint shifting noise, not loud enough to be called a crack. Just a movement. Elena rose slowly and stepped closer. She ran her hand along the stones. They felt solid, cold. Atlas stood and moved beside her. He sniffed once along the base of the wall, then turned away abruptly, as if unsure. "Probably just drafts," she said, more to herself than to him. He did not lie down again near the stove. Instead, he repositioned himself closer to the front door, body angled toward both the entrance and the back wall, a protective vantage point. The lantern flickered slightly. Elena prepared a simple dinner, crackers, cheese, a thermos of soup she'd brought from town. Atlas ate from his bowl without rushing, then returned to his post near the door. Outside, night thickened around the clearing. No distant traffic, no city hum, just wind and the occasional creak of branches under cold. Elena sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea. The house felt smaller now that darkness had sealed the windows. The stone wall behind the stove seemed darker than the rest of the room, its uneven surface catching the lantern light in strange angles. She caught herself staring at it longer than necessary. The wind moved again. Not a howl. A push. The back wall responded with a subtle, uneven sound, like breath pressed through narrow spaces. Atlas rose immediately. He walked back toward the stove, but he didn't lie down. He stood, ears forward, eyes locked on the stones. Then he stepped away, deliberately. He returned to the front door and lowered himself there instead. He would not settle near the stove. Elena watched him for a long moment. "You're being dramatic," she murmured softly. But she didn't move his bed back toward the warmth. She left it where he chose. Later, when she climbed the narrow staircase to the small loft bedroom, Atlas followed halfway, then paused. He glanced back toward the main room, the stone wall, then up at her. She nodded once. He came up the rest of the way, though he positioned himself at the top of the stairs rather than beside the bed, guarding both directions. Elena lay awake longer than she expected. The mattress creaked beneath her weight. The scent of old wood and ash drifted upward from below. The wind shifted against the house in irregular intervals, each time brushing that back wall with a low, whispering tone. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. But it wasn't random either. The house did not feel empty. It felt aware. Eventually, exhaustion pressed heavier than unease. Her breathing slowed. Atlas did not sleep deeply. His ears flicked at every change in the wind. And somewhere along the back wall, where timber met stone and stone met mountain, something seemed to move just slightly out of rhythm with the night. Elena didn't realize she had been holding her breath until she exhaled. Atlas heard it first. He was on his feet before she even opened her eyes, a soft shift of weight, of a quiet step across the floorboards below. Not frantic, not barking, listening. She pushed herself up on one elbow in the loft and waited. The house had settled into that deep, midnight stillness mountain homes carry. No headlights through the trees, no distant engines, just wind brushing pine needles and the low murmur of cold against stone. Then, a faint scrape. Not from the porch, not from the roof, from inside. Elena sat up fully. Atlas moved to the base of the stone wall behind the stove. She could see his silhouette in the faint gray of early dawn pushing through the windows. His ears were angled forward. His body was rigid but controlled. He lowered his nose to the floor. Paused. Then, very deliberately, he scratched once at the wooden boards near the base of the wall. Not rapid, not excited. One controlled motion. He stepped back. Looked at her. "Atlas?" she whispered. He didn't move. The sound came again, a faint shift behind the stone, as if air were passing through something narrow and uneven. Elena climbed down the loft stairs slowly. The wood creaked beneath her feet. She felt the cold in the room more sharply now. The fire had burned low, leaving only a bed of dim coals. Atlas remained fixed on the same section of floor. She crouched beside him and pressed her palm flat against the boards. Cold, solid. Another faint sound. This time more like a hollow thud. Her pulse quickened. "Mouse," she said softly, though she didn't believe it. Atlas's ears twitched at her voice, but he didn't shift his focus. Elena tapped the board with her knuckles. The sound was dull. She moved her hand slightly to the right and tapped again. Different. A deeper echo she stilled. Atlas stepped forward and scratched once more in the exact same place. Then he stopped again, waiting. The behavior wasn't frantic. He wasn't chasing movement. He was indicating something. Elena stood and moved the small rug aside from the base of the stove. Dust lifted in a thin cloud. The boards beneath were worn smooth with age, but one plank near the wall looked slightly darker than the rest. Subtle. Almost nothing. She ran her fingers along its edge. A thin seam caught the light at just the right angle. Her stomach tightened. She went to the shed and returned with a flat pry bar and a small hammer. Atlas followed close behind her, not excited, not fearful, intent. She slid the pry bar gently along the seam and applied pressure. Nothing. She shifted her angle and tried again. The wood resisted. She leaned her weight into it. A faint metallic click sounded beneath the floor. She froze. Atlas's tail lifted slightly. Not wagging, just aware. Elena pressed harder. The plank rose half an inch at one corner, revealing a narrow gap. Cold air drifted upward from beneath the floorboards. Not the stale air of a crawl space. Something deeper. Her breath clouded faintly in front of her face. She worked slowly, lifting the plank carefully so it wouldn't splinter. The wood came free in her hands, revealing a cavity cut cleanly into the foundation beneath the stove. Inside sat a rectangular metal box, dark gray, sealed, heavy. Atlas leaned forward to sniff, but didn't touch it. Elena reached into the opening and pulled the box free. It was heavier than she expected. solid, deliberate. There was no lock, only two metal clasps secured tightly. She carried it to the oak table and set it down. The house felt different now, not haunted, not threatening, just layered. Atlas remained close to her leg as she unlatched the clasps. The lid opened with a soft hiss, breaking the seal. Inside were items wrapped carefully in oilcloth, protected from moisture, preserved. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the first bundle. A folded map, thick paper, creased with age but intact. When she spread it flat, she saw a detailed topographic rendering of the ridge behind the house. Hand-drawn contour lines, elevation marks, several red circles marked along the slope, coordinates written in Rose's tight handwriting. Atlas shifted again. Elena swallowed. She reached for the second bundle, a small notebook. Leather-bound, worn at the corners. Inside, page after page of technical notes, measurements, load calculations, soil density assessments, dates stretching back decades. Rose's handwriting filled every margin. Not gardening notes, not grocery lists. Engineering work. The third item was a stack of folded letters. Official letterhead from a mining company dated 1974. Proposals for expansion. Requests for access to the ridge. Mentions of survey disputes. And one letter from Rosa. Firm, precise, objecting. The final page of the notebook carried a single line written darker than the rest. If they return, the ridge won't hold. Elena felt the words settle in her chest. Atlas let out a low, almost inaudible sound. Not a growl, more like a warning rumble beneath his breath. She turned another page. Detailed sketches of a tunnel bored into the mountain face. Reinforcement beams marked unstable. Red X's across certain support points. Her grandmother hadn't been hiding from the world. She had been documenting it. The draft from beneath the floor grew colder against her ankles. Elena glanced back toward the open cavity. The air wasn't coming from beneath the house. It was moving through something beyond it. Atlas stepped closer to the stone wall behind the stove again and pressed his nose near the base. He inhaled deeply, then growled, this time louder, not aggressive, alert. Elena closed the metal box but did not return it to the cavity. She looked from the wall to the map and back again. The ridge loomed just beyond those stones. Her grandmother had hidden this deliberately. Not in a closet, not in a drawer, inside the foundation itself. Atlas placed himself between her and the stone wall, body squared, stance steady. Outside, the wind moved across the mountain again. But this time it didn't sound like breath. It sounded like pressure. Not the kind that rattles windows or slams doors. Not a storm trying to break in. This was quieter, steady, as if something immense rested its weight against the mountain and waited. Elena stood still in the center of the room, the open metal box on the table behind her. Atlas did not take his eyes off the stone wall. His body had shifted into something she recognized, protective, but measured. He wasn't panicking. He was evaluating. The draft along her ankles continued, subtle but undeniable. She stepped away from the wall slowly and returned to the table. The maps lay open beneath the lantern light. Contour lines traced the ridge with precision. Red circles marked specific points near the base of the slope. One of them was directly behind the house. Her grandmother's handwriting filled the margins. She picked up the notebook again and flipped back to the earlier entries. Dates, measurements, soil readings, calculations that referenced load distribution and subsurface erosion. The language was technical, confident, not the writing of a hobbyist, not a recluse scribbling theories. This was professional work. Elena's mind searched for the memory and found it slowly, like a photograph developing in darkroom fluid. Rosa once mentioned studying engineering in her 20s, briefly, before marriage, before moving west. It had always sounded like a detail that never mattered. She reached for the letters again. Official letterhead from Silvercrest Mining Company, 1974. A proposal for expansion of a dormant seam located along the North Ridge. Preliminary blasting plans. Access requests. One response stood out. Rosa's letter. It was typed, but signed in blue ink. She read it carefully. Your preliminary assessments underestimate the instability of the lower ridge strata. Further blasting would compromise structural integrity across the western slope. Elena swallowed. She read the final line twice. I will not grant access to my property for this operation. Atlas shifted, his nails clicking lightly on the floor. The mountain pressed again, a low vibration more felt than heard. Elena turned the page. A sketch of a tunnel entrance, hand-drawn. Reinforcement beams marked with red lines where stress fractures had formed. Notes beside them. Inadequate bracing. Poor drainage. Water intrusion accelerating rock decay. She flipped further. Another entry. Spring thaw. Noticeable microfractures widening along seam line. If reopened without full reinforcement, ridge could shear. She felt something move in her chest. Not fear exactly. Something sharper. Atlas let out another low sound, this one closer to a growl. She looked up. He was staring at the map now, specifically at the circle marked behind the house. Elena followed his gaze. That red circle connected by a faint pencil line to the outline of the foundation. Her pulse quickened. She returned to the cavity beneath the stove and shined the lantern down inside. The space was deeper than she'd first assumed. Not just a shallow compartment carved into the foundation. There was stone beyond it. Cut stone. Not natural rock. Masonry. She reached in and ran her fingers along the interior edge. Cold. Precise. Her grandmother hadn't just hidden a box. She had built something into the mountain-facing wall. The draft strengthened slightly, as if in response to her movement. Atlas stepped forward and placed himself directly between Elena and the open cavity. His posture was firm now. He looked at her, then at the wall again. You think it goes deeper, she murmured. He didn't move. She stood slowly and walked to the window facing the ridge. Morning light had climbed higher now, illuminating the rocky slope in clear detail. Pine roots gripped into crevices. Snow lingered in narrow shadows. The ridge did not look unstable. It looked ancient, immovable. But Rosa had drawn fracture lines beneath that surface. Elena remembered something else then. A summer afternoon when she was 12. Rosa pointing to the ridge after a thunderstorm, explaining how water seeps into cracks, freezes, expands. How mountains don't fall all at once. They loosen quietly over years. Rock remembers pressure, Rosa had said. Elena turned back toward the table and gathered the papers carefully. She arranged them in order. Mining proposal, Rosa's objections, survey calculations. The final page of the notebook lay separate. If they return, the ridge won't hold. She traced the words lightly with her finger. Return. meaning they had tried once before. Atlas's growl deepened slightly, and she followed his line of sight again. He wasn't looking at the wall now. He was looking toward the back door. The wind shifted direction. For a moment, the draft in the room reversed, pulling inward instead of outward. Elena walked slowly to the door and opened it. Cold air rushed in. The clearing was quiet, pine branches still, snow undisturbed. But the ridge behind the house felt closer than it had yesterday. She stepped onto the porch and scanned the slope. Nothing moved. Yet the feeling remained. Someone had tried to use that ridge once. Her grandmother had stopped them. And whatever Rosa had feared had been serious enough to seal documents into the foundation of her home. Atlas stood beside her now, shoulder brushing her leg. His gaze remained fixed on the upper slope. Elena closed the door gently and leaned her back against it. The house felt smaller, not fragile, contained, as if it had been built to brace against something. She carried the metal box to the table and closed it carefully, but she did not return it to the cavity. She left the hatch open. The draft continued to move through the gap, steady and patient. The mountain was not silent anymore. It was waiting. And now she knew her grandmother had been waiting too. Waiting for someone to look closely, to listen long enough, to take the ridge seriously. Elena didn't sleep much that night. Every shift of wind against the back wall carried new meaning. Not fear exactly, just awareness sharpened into something restless. By morning, the sky had cleared into a brittle blue. The temperature had dropped overnight, hard enough to freeze the top layer of snow into a thin crust that cracked underfoot. Atlas was at the door before she reached for her coat. He waited until she opened it, then stepped outside first, nose low, breath fogging in steady bursts. His paws pressed clean patterns into the snow as he circled the house once. Elena followed more slowly, pulling her gloves tight around her wrists. The clearing looked peaceful in daylight. Pine branches bowed under white weight. The ridge stood dark and unmoved behind the house. She walked along the back wall, tracing the line where stone met slope. And then she saw it. Tire tracks. Not faint, not old. Deep, wide grooves cut sharply through the fresh snow behind the house, veering toward the tree line that led up the ridge. Her heart dropped in a single, clean motion. These weren't from her car. The path she'd driven remained near the front clearing. These tracks were heavier, wider. Atlas stopped beside the nearest indentation. He lowered his head and inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring. The fur along his spine lifted slightly. He did not bark. He followed the tracks a few steps toward the trees, then paused and looked back at her. "Easy," she murmured. The snow around the grooves had been disturbed recently. The edges were still crisp, not softened by melt or wind. Someone had driven here after she arrived. Elena crouched and pressed her gloved fingers into one of the impressions. The tread pattern was aggressive, industrial, not a local pickup truck. Her eyes lifted slowly toward the ridge. Atlas gave a low sound in his throat, not loud enough to echo, but enough to carry intention. She straightened and followed the tracks until they disappeared between two pines that opened toward the slope. The forest there was denser, shadows deeper. She did not go farther, not yet. The sound of an engine reached her before she saw the vehicle. It rolled up the dirt path from town in a smooth, controlled ascent. Too quiet to be old, too steady to be casual. Atlas turned immediately, positioning himself slightly ahead of her. A dark SUV emerged from between the trees and came to a stop in the clearing. Clean lines, glossy paint, out of place against weathered timber and snow-dusted stone. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, mid-40s perhaps, dressed in a tailored winter coat that looked more urban than mountain. His boots were polished, his hair carefully styled despite the wind. He removed his sunglasses slowly. "Mrs. Marquez?" he called out, his tone friendly but practiced. Elena did not correct him. "Yes." He smiled with easy confidence and approached halfway across the clearing before stopping, respectful of distance. "My name is Grant Holcomb," he said, extending a hand she did not take. "I represent Frontier Resource Renewal." Atlas stepped forward just enough to close the gap between them. Grant glanced down briefly at the dog. "Beautiful shepherd," he said lightly. "Well trained, I imagine." "He listens," Elena replied. Grant nodded, as if that confirmed something. "We've been conducting environmental restoration projects across several mountain communities," he continued, "clearing abandoned infrastructure, securing unstable land, preserving natural resources." Elena kept her gaze steady. "Behind my house?" Grant's smile thinned slightly, though it remained polite. "We've surveyed the ridge for potential environmental hazards. Old mining remnants, that sort of thing. Nothing active, just precaution." Atlas's ears tilted forward. Elena folded her arms against the cold. "Those tracks are precaution?" Grant glanced toward the tree line, then back at her. "Our vehicles are necessary for safe assessment. The mountain has a history, as I'm sure you're aware." She held his gaze. "I'm becoming aware." Grant shifted his weight. "Which brings me to the reason I'm here. Frontier is prepared to make an immediate offer on your property. A generous one. More than fair market value." Elena almost laughed at that. "Fair market," she repeated softly. "For land you've already been driving on?" He didn't flinch. "We're interested in protecting the area before it deteriorates further. It would benefit the town. Stability, jobs, security." "Stability," she echoed. Atlas stepped closer, his shoulder brushing her leg. Not aggressive, present. Grant's eyes flicked briefly toward the ridge again. "You've only just returned," he continued smoothly. "You may not want the responsibility of maintaining a property this remote." Responsibility. The word settled heavily. "I'll think about it," she said. Grant smiled wider now, satisfied with something in her answer. "Of course. We're not in a rush." He reached into his coat and handed her a card. "Frontier Resource Renewal. No address in Silver Ridge. Just a regional office listed in Denver." Atlas did not take his eyes off him as he stepped backward toward his SUV. Grant opened the door, then paused. "Mountains can be unpredictable," he said casually. "Better to let professionals handle them." The engine started smoothly. He reversed carefully and drove back down the path toward town. Silence returned. The clearing felt colder than before. Elena stared at the card in her hand. Atlas moved past her and returned to the tracks in the snow, nose pressed deep into the grooves left by the tires. He followed them again toward the tree line, then stopped and looked back. The ridge loomed above. Snow slid quietly from a pine branch somewhere high on the slope, landing with a muted thud. The mountain had not changed, but something else had. Elena tucked the card into her pocket and looked once more at the industrial tracks cutting across old snow. The wind moved lightly across the ridge. This time, it did not sound like breath. It sounded like warning. Elena stood there a long moment after Grant's SUV disappeared down the dirt road. The clearing felt too open now, too exposed. Atlas remained focused on the tire tracks. He moved in short, careful steps along the compressed snow, nose hovering just above the surface. He inhaled, paused, inhaled again. His body was different now, not curious, not uncertain, alert. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's see." She went inside and pulled Rosa's map from the table. The red circle behind the house connected by a faint pencil line to another marking higher up the ridge. 1/2 mile, maybe a little more. She folded the map and tucked it into her coat pocket. Atlas was already at the tree line. The snow beneath the pines was thinner, shaded from direct sun. Their boots and paws made soft, rhythmic sounds as they climbed. The slope steepened gradually, the air thinning further as they moved away from the clearing. Elena's breath grew heavier. Atlas did not slow. He followed the industrial tracks for a short distance, then veered slightly left, ignoring the deeper grooves and choosing a narrower line that cut through younger trees. "You smell something else," she murmured. He did not look back. The forest grew quieter as they climbed. No birds, no distant truck engines, just the soft rasp of wind through needles. The ridge face appeared suddenly between 2 tall pines, a wall of rock rising unevenly from the slope. Snow clung in pockets along the ledges. Frost outlined cracks like white scars. Atlas stopped. His ears tilted sharply forward. Elena stepped up beside him. At first she saw nothing but rock and shadow. Then she noticed it. A section of the slope that didn't match the rest. The snow there had been disturbed and loosely scattered back into place. A faint, straight line where rock met something darker. She brushed snow aside with her glove. Metal. A rusted edge barely visible beneath stone fragments and pine debris. Atlas pressed closer, nose working rapidly. "It's here," she whispered. She cleared more snow and uncovered the shape of a low, concealed opening built into the rock face. Reinforced once, decades ago, now partially disguised again. The tunnel entrance, the one Rosa had drawn. Elena felt her pulse in her throat. Atlas stepped forward first, placing one paw on the edge of the opening. He paused, listening. No sound from within, just the steady hum of wind outside. She switched on her flashlight and crouched low. The beam cut into darkness, illuminating steel beams lining the tunnel interior. Some were bent, some were heavily corroded. Moisture glistened along the walls. Atlas entered slowly. His body lowered slightly as he moved, not crouching, but prepared. Elena followed. The air inside was colder than outside. Dense. It smelled faintly metallic. The tunnel extended farther than she expected, long enough to disappear into darkness beyond the reach of her flashlight. Water dripped somewhere deeper within. She studied the beams carefully. Several had hairline fractures spreading from bolt joints. Others had rust eaten through entire corners. Atlas suddenly froze. She nearly bumped into him. He turned his head sharply toward the ground in front of her boots. Loose shale shifted beneath her right foot. She stepped back instantly. A small cascade of stones tumbled down a narrow slope inside the tunnel and disappeared into darkness with a hollow echo. Atlas moved forward carefully, stepping only where the surface appeared compacted. Good boy, she whispered. They advanced slowly. About 30 yards inside, the tunnel widened slightly into a small chamber. Elena's flashlight swept across the walls and caught something fluorescent. Spray paint. Fresh. Bright orange marks circling specific support beams. She felt her stomach tighten. Atlas gave a low growl. She stepped closer to one of the painted markings. It circled a beam that Rose's sketch had labeled unstable. The paint was new. The metal beneath it had been scraped recently. Her flashlight beam moved lower. Drill residue. Fine gray dust gathered in small piles near the base of the rock wall. Too clean to be from the original excavation. Someone had been here. Recently. Atlas shifted suddenly, body tensing. He stepped directly in front of her again. This time he nudged her thigh firmly with his muzzle and moved left. She followed his line of sight. A support beam ahead was cracked through its base. Not fully broken, but stressed. The ground beneath it was fractured. She had been about to step across it. Atlas positioned himself between her and the beam until she adjusted her path. "Twice," she murmured. "You stopped me twice." He glanced back at her briefly, then continued scanning the tunnel. She crouched near the spray-painted marking and touched the rock surface lightly. The paint flaked slightly beneath her glove. Not weeks old. Days. Maybe hours. The realization landed heavily. Grant hadn't come out of curiosity. They were already working the ridge. Testing it. The air felt thinner suddenly. Atlas's growl deepened, not toward her, not toward the tunnel entrance, toward something deeper within. Elena switched off her flashlight for a moment. Darkness swallowed the space entirely. She listened. There it was. Faint. Mechanical vibration carried through rock. Not loud enough to echo. Just enough to be felt in her bones. She turned the flashlight back on. "We're not alone," she said softly. Atlas stepped backward, closer to her leg. They retreated slowly toward the entrance. Elena did not turn her back to the chamber until the daylight from outside reached her shoulders again. When they stepped into open air, she felt as though she had surfaced from underwater. The sky above was clear and deceptively calm. Atlas stood at the entrance and looked back once more into the tunnel before stepping fully outside. Elena brushed snow over the disturbed area again, though it felt useless now. They began the descent back toward the house. Halfway down, Atlas paused and turned sharply uphill. She followed his gaze. No visible movement. But the ridge felt charged now, alive in a way that had nothing to do with wind. Back in the clearing, she turned toward the slope behind the house and studied it differently than before. Not as scenery, not as backdrop, as structure, as something bearing weight. Rosa's words repeated in her mind. If they return, the ridge won't hold. Elena looked down at Atlas. "You knew," she said quietly. He didn't wag. He didn't bark. He simply stood beside her, eyes fixed on the mountain. And this time the silence didn't feel protective. It felt fragile. Not the house, not the ridge exactly. The balance. Elena stood in the clearing longer than she meant to, studying the slope as if she could see through rock and soil to whatever lay shifting beneath. Atlas remained beside her, body angled toward the tree line. His tail hung still. When they went back inside, the room felt smaller than before. The open hatch beneath the stove remained uncovered. The metal box still sat on the table beside the lantern. Everything looked the same. But it wasn't. Elena closed the hatch carefully and slid the plank back into place. She did not seal it. Not yet. She spread Rosa's maps out across the table again, comparing the red circles to what she'd seen inside the tunnel. The spray-painted beams, the fresh drill residue. They weren't stabilizing anything. They were testing it. Atlas moved toward the front window. He stood there, watching the dirt road. Elena followed his gaze just as an engine noise drifted up through the trees. Not loud. Smooth. Controlled. Her shoulders tightened. The same dark SUV emerged into the clearing and rolled to a stop. Grant Holcomb stepped out again, this time without sunglasses. His coat was darker today, more practical, but still too clean for the terrain. Atlas stepped in front of Elena before she could move. Grant offered the same polite smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Marquez." "Elena," she corrected quietly. "Of course, Elena." He glanced briefly toward the ridge, then back at her. "I hope you've had time to consider our offer." She studied his face. The friendliness didn't reach his eyes. "You've been on the ridge," she said. Grant didn't blink. "Our survey team conducts routine assessments across the region." "Spray paint and drill residue are routine?" The smile thinned again. "Elena, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're evaluating long-term environmental risk. That tunnel you found? It's unstable. Dangerous." "You already knew that." He paused. "Silver Ridge deserves protection," he said smoothly. "Your grandmother opposed expansion decades ago. Different time. Different technology." Elena felt heat rise in her chest. "My grandmother was right." Grant's jaw shifted slightly. With respect, she was overly cautious. Atlas gave a low growl, not loud, but steady. Grant's eyes flicked to the dog. "You have a very loyal companion," he said. "Yes." Grant took a step forward. Atlas stepped forward too. The movement was subtle, but clear. Grant stopped. "The ridge contains valuable mineral deposits," he said more plainly now. "Resources that can benefit this community. Jobs, infrastructure." "And if it collapses?" Elena asked. He smiled again. "It won't. You've tested it. We've assessed it. You've drilled it." Grant's expression cooled. "Elena, you're new back in town. I understand this property has sentimental value, but sentiment doesn't stabilize rock. And drilling does?" He exhaled through his nose. "We have engineers." So did she. The silence stretched between them. Wind brushed across the clearing. Grant shifted tactics. "We're prepared to increase the offer, significantly, enough to give you comfort anywhere you choose to relocate." Atlas's growl deepened slightly. Grant's gaze hardened. "You don't want to be responsible for obstructing something that helps this town." Elena felt the pressure in his tone now, the friendliness thinning to something more deliberate. "You mean I don't want to be blamed?" she said. Grant didn't answer that. Instead, he stepped closer to the porch, just within the boundary Atlas had drawn. "Mountains shift," he said quietly. "Accidents happen. Old structures collapse. Fires start." The implication hung in the cold air. Atlas stepped fully in front of Elena now. His stance widened, head level, ears forward. He did not bark. He did not lunge. He simply stood. Grant looked at the dog, then back at her. "I'd hate to see this place damaged," he added. Elena held his gaze. "You already have." A flicker crossed his face. Irritation, maybe. Then it was gone. He straightened his coat. "We'll be in touch," he said calmly. He turned and walked back toward the SUV. Atlas did not relax until the vehicle disappeared down the dirt road again. The clearing felt colder after he left. Elena's hands trembled slightly, though she kept them steady at her sedan. Inside the house, the walls seemed to absorb the silence. She closed the door and leaned against it briefly. Atlas paced once across the room, then returned to the window facing the ridge. Evening fell quickly. As darkness thickened, the air carried something new, not wind, a vibration, faint at first, then clearer, low machinery echoing through the valley. Elena stepped onto the porch. The sound came from higher on the ridge, distant, mechanical. Atlas stood rigid beside her, body angled toward the source. The noise stopped abruptly. The silence afterward felt louder. She looked at the slope and imagined what she could not see: equipment positioned near the tunnel. Tests. Pressure. The balance she'd felt that morning now seemed thinner, more strained. Atlas did not take his eyes off the ridge. And for the first time since she arrived, Elena understood that whatever Rosa had stopped once was starting again. The machinery didn't run all night. It pulsed. Low, distant, controlled. Elena lay awake listening to the intervals between sound and silence. Atlas did not sleep at all. He remained positioned at the top of the loft stairs, head raised toward the back of the house. Around 4:30 in the morning, the vibration deepened. Not louder, stronger. She felt it through the mattress first. A subtle tremor beneath wood and stone. Atlas was on his feet instantly. "That's not wind," she whispered. She pulled on her boots and coat without turning on the lantern. The sky outside the window was still dark, just a faint gray band forming along the horizon. When she opened the door, the cold air struck hard against her face. The ridge loomed black against the paling sky. And then a muted thud rolled down the slope. Not an explosion, a contained blast. Atlas flinched, but did not retreat. He ran toward the tree line. "Elena, move," she muttered to herself, following. They climbed faster than before, breath visible in short bursts. The snow crust cracked under her weight, each step sharper than the last. Another controlled detonation echoed through the rock. This time the ground trembled enough to send a faint ripple through the surface snow. They reached the ridge clearing just as dawn began to bleed color into the sky. Below the concealed tunnel entrance, smoke drifted in thin gray ribbons. The camouflage stones had been partially removed. A portable generator sat to the side, its exhaust pipe still vibrating faintly. Extension cords ran toward the tunnel interior. No crew in sight. They had stepped away after the test. Elena crouched low behind a cluster of scrub pine. Atlas pressed against her leg, ears angled forward. She watched the slope above the tunnel. Fine lines ran across the snow, hairline fractures that hadn't been there yesterday. Subtle but spreading. A soft, cracking sound traveled through the rock face. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just the sound of something under stress. Atlas shifted suddenly and moved sharply to her left. He tugged at her sleeve with his teeth. "Wait." He pulled harder this time. She stumbled sideways just as a small section of shale broke loose above them and slid down the face of the ridge. It wasn't large, but it wasn't nothing. The rocks scattered across the slope, sending a spray of snow and gravel outward. Atlas had already moved them out of its path. She stared at the broken section. The fracture line extended upward farther than she expected. Her grandmother's red X marks flashed in her memory. Elena edged closer to the tunnel entrance, careful where she stepped. Inside, the support beams bore fresh stress marks where the blast shock had traveled through the structure. One beam near the opening had shifted slightly off alignment. She crouched near the base and ran her hand along the ground. Fine dust still drifted in the air. They were testing pressure points. Atlas turned sharply toward a narrow path that branched off behind the ridge. He moved quickly, then stopped, waiting. She followed him along the alternate path Rosa had drawn faintly on the map, a route that curved away from the main entrance. The slope dipped slightly before rising again. Halfway along, the ground changed texture, packed earth beneath thin snow. Atlas stepped carefully and stopped again. Elena scanned the area. The fracture lines extended here too, but they angled toward the valley below, toward Silver Ridge. If the ridge failed, it wouldn't collapse inward. It would shear outward, down. She pulled out her phone and began recording. The cracked snow lines, the loose shale, the misaligned beam. The generator positioned beside the entrance. She panned slowly, capturing the unstable sections Rosa had once marked decades earlier. Atlas remained beside her, scanning the tree line. A sudden metallic clang echoed from deeper within the tunnel. She froze. Atlas's posture shifted instantly. No barking, just stillness. Footsteps crunched faintly inside. Not many. One. She pulled Atlas gently back toward the alternate path. They retreated silently, using the slope to block direct line of sight to the entrance. The sky brightened fully now, revealing the ridge in stark morning light. It looked solid, but she had seen the fractures, heard the cracks, felt the tremor. When they reached the lower clearing, Elena turned back one final time. Smoke still drifted lazily from the tunnel mouth. The mountain had absorbed the blast, this time, but the stress remained. Atlas leaned against her leg briefly, steady and grounded. She placed her hand on his neck. "Rosa was right," she whispered. The realization settled fully now. Not fear, not anger. Clarity. They weren't stabilizing the ridge. They were gambling with it. And if they miscalculated, the town below would never see it coming. Atlas gave a quiet huff and looked toward the valley. The ridge stood tall behind them. But for the first time, Elena understood exactly how fragile that height truly was, and how close it stood to breaking. Elena didn't wait for another blast. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, she had packed Rosa's maps, the leather-bound notebook, and the footage from her phone into a canvas bag. Atlas watched her move through the house with a focused stillness, as if he understood this was no longer about curiosity. It was about timing. She locked the door behind her and drove down the mountain road without looking back. The town of Silver Ridge came into view slowly, smoke rising from chimneys, morning light catching the diner's windows. It looked ordinary. She parked outside the county building, a square brick structure with a faded flag snapping lightly in the breeze. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly above rows of worn chairs. Atlas remained in the back seat. He didn't whine. He didn't scratch at the window. He watched. Elena stepped inside. The receptionist glanced up briefly. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak with someone about land stability," Elena said, steady. It took 2 referrals and 1 raised eyebrow before she was shown into a small office where a thin man in his 70s sat behind a desk stacked with geological reports. Harold Kincaid, retired geologist, consultant. He adjusted his glasses and studied her carefully. "What kind of land stability?" he asked. Elena spread Rosa's maps across his desk. His posture shifted. He leaned forward slowly. "These contour markings," he murmured. "Where did you get this?" "My grandmother," she replied. He examined the red X markings along the ridge. "These are accurate stress points," he said quietly. She knew what she was doing. Elena pulled out her phone and played the footage. The crack lines, the drifting dust, the misaligned beam. Harold watched without speaking. When the video ended, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "They're drilling," he said. "Yes." "And the ridge is already compromised." "Yes." He removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. "If they continue," he continued carefully, "the shear plane could fail along the western slope." "Toward town," she said. He nodded once. Silence filled the office. Then he reached for the phone. The next few days moved quickly. County officials contacted state environmental oversight. Engineers arrived quietly to inspect the ridge. Temporary stop work notices were filed. Frontier's permits were reviewed under emergency review status. The machinery on the ridge went silent. Elena watched from the porch as official vehicles climbed the mountain road, white trucks with state insignia on their doors. They remained professional, methodical. Grant Holcomb did not come with them. She saw him only once more, from a distance. His SUV paused at the base of the ridge road, while officials conducted inspections. He did not get out. Atlas stood beside her on the porch, body relaxed but eyes sharp. Within weeks, the decision was made public. Frontier Resource Renewal's expansion permits were suspended pending federal geological review. Preliminary findings cited instability concerns along the lower ridge strata. The machinery disappeared. The generator was removed. The camouflage stones near the tunnel were dismantled under state supervision. The ridge fell quiet again. One afternoon, as Elena was stacking firewood near the shed, she noticed something different. No vibration, no low mechanical hum, just wind moving through pine branches. Harold Kincaid visited once, climbing the mountain in his old pickup. He stepped carefully from his truck and studied the slope behind the house. "Your grandmother was right," he said simply. Elena nodded. "She documented everything," he continued. "That ridge would have gone eventually if they'd pushed it." He glanced at Atlas, who sat calmly beside her. "Good dog," he added. Atlas thumped his tail once. When Harold drove away, the clearing felt lighter somehow. The air still carried winter cold, but it no longer felt charged. Elena stood on the porch and looked toward the valley. Silver Ridge went about its business below. People moved in and out of shops. Trucks rolled through intersections. Life continued, unaware of how close the balance had come to shifting. Atlas moved to the edge of the porch and lay down, chin resting between his paws. He did not watch the ridge now. He watched the road, and this time there was nothing coming up it. The mountain stood tall behind the house, scarred but intact. For now. Elena stepped down into the snow and walked a few paces into the clearing. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the house, the trees, the slope. She had arrived here thinking she would repair the roof, list the property, and leave. Instead, she had uncovered something Rosa had protected for decades, and for the first time since returning, the silence didn't feel fragile. It felt earned. Atlas rose and came to stand beside her. The ridge loomed above them, steady and still, and below, The town continued, unaware that the mountain had almost spoken too loudly. But it hadn't. Not this time. The words lingered in Elena's mind long after the officials' trucks disappeared from the ridge road for the final time. The mountain had been tested, pressured, measured, and still it stood. Winter loosened its grip slowly. Snow receded first from the lower clearing, revealing damp earth and stubborn patches of grass flattened beneath months of white. Meltwater traced thin silver paths downhill, slipping quietly through pine roots and stone. Atlas walked those paths each morning, nose low, tracking the scent of thaw. His coat had thickened again with health. The faint scars across his shoulders were still visible when sunlight struck at the right angle, but they no longer defined him. His stride had grown confident, relaxed. The house changed too. Elena replaced the warped porch boards one at a time, sanding them smooth before sealing them against weather. She repaired the gutters, cleaned the windows until light poured in without distortion. The iron stove gleamed again after hours of careful polishing. She didn't rush. Each nail felt deliberate. Each repaired hinge carried weight. Temporary had faded quietly into something else. By early April, wild lupine pushed up in clusters along the edge of the clearing, purple against green, a color Rosa had always loved. Elena stood in the barn one afternoon, sunlight filtering through slats in the wood walls. Dust floated in soft spirals as she cleared out old crates and rusted farm tools. She set up folding tables along the back wall, hung canvas sheets from hooks, arranged jars of brushes and charcoal in neat rows. The first Saturday class had only 3 children, 2 brothers from town and a shy girl who barely looked up from her boots. Their parents dropped them off cautiously, glancing up at the ridge as if it might speak. Atlas lay near the open barn door during the session, not in the way, not seeking attention, just present. The children watched him at first. Then they began to draw. Mountains, pine trees, the ridge. One boy drew a dog larger than the house. Elena smiled without correcting scale. Word traveled quietly. More children came the following weeks. Not many. Just enough. Sometimes she opened the barn for something else. Working dogs from town, herders, search dogs, the occasional anxious rescue, spent afternoons in the fenced section she built behind the house. Atlas supervised without fuss. He corrected gently when needed. A low huff, a glance, a shift in posture. He never barked without reason. The ridge remained still above them. One evening near the end of spring, Elena carried a small wooden box from the house and set it on the table near the hearth. Inside lay Rosa's original survey compass, brass worn dull with age, glass scratched faintly across the surface. She turned it slowly in her hands. Atlas watched from his place near the door. She mounted the compass above the stone hearth, directly above where the hidden hatch had once remained open. She left the hatch sealed now, the metal box secured elsewhere in the house. The compass faced outward, toward the ridge. Elena stepped back and studied it in the warm firelight. The house no longer felt pressed against the mountain. It felt anchored. She thought of Rosa sitting at this same table decades ago, calculating stress points while the town below moved on without knowing. They had called her stubborn, private, difficult. But Rosa had known exactly what she was protecting. Elena walked outside just as the last light of day softened the ridge into deep blue shadow. Atlas followed. They stood together at the edge of the clearing. Silver Ridge glowed faintly in the valley below. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Smoke rose gently from chimneys. Life moved, unaware of how close it had come to shifting. Elena felt no triumph, no anger, just a steady, grounded calm. The mountain had revealed its secret not in a dramatic collapse, but in fracture lines, in quiet tremors, in warnings written decades earlier and hidden beneath stone. It had required someone to return, to look, to listen. Atlas leaned lightly against her leg, warm and solid. She rested her hand on his neck and watched the sky deepen above the ridge. Some places look forgotten from the outside, worthless even, too remote, too quiet. But sometimes those places are holding more than memory. Sometimes they are holding the line. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand where someone once stood alone and choose not to step away. The mountain remained still. The house remained steady. And for the first time since she had driven back to Silver Ridge, Elena knew she wasn't leaving. The ridge did not need defending anymore. It needed tending.
And she was exactly where she was meant to be. The ridge had gone quiet again. No engines, no tremors, just wind moving through pine needle and the shuffling of Rosa compass settling against stone as the fire warmed the wall. Elena stood in the doorway of the barn, while the last of children ran down the path toward town. Their rowing tucked under their arms. Atlas lay at her feet, head resting on his paw, watching the ridge the way he always had, not with fear, not with suspicion, just attention. She talked about that first night back, how she had told herself she was only here to sail, to lose a chapter, to leave Lily this time. She hadn't come back to defend anything. She had come back to disappear quietly. But the mountain hadn't let her. It was Alec who heard what she didn't, the shift in the wall, the wrongness beneath the floor. The fracture lie under her boot. Thrice he pulled her away from danger before she even knew she was in it. He never tried to fix the ridge. He just refused to ignore it. And somewhere between Rosa rest and the flat rest in the nose, Elena understood something she hadn't before. That living isn't a way train. Sometimes stay in it. The mountain didn't collapse. It didn't roar. It simply held because someone paid attention in time. She looked up at the ridge, then down at Atlas. If he hadn't listened that first night, if she hadn't followed, would the town below even now what almost happened? And in your own life, what quiet warning have you almost walked past?